I also have a couple of other SWCD staff on here, Miranda Wagner and Dan Sabolka. They're going to help field questions that you have coming through the chat window and also help answer some. So let's get to it. And this is my first time hosting, so if I'm a little slow to get things going, I apologize. So here's the agenda for the day. I'm just going to go over the Lawns to Legumes program overview, kind of give a background on that, how it started, then go into how we selected the demonstration neighborhood, and then go over the different types of planting options that are available, and then finish up with the financial assistance process and answer any questions. And I'll also have a few stopping points throughout the presentation to answer any questions that you have. So you don't have to hold off on those throughout the entire presentation. I want to kind of treat this a little informally, like we were actually in person with asking questions throughout the presentation. So background on Lawns to Legumes. There was legislation passed in 2019 to provide funding for residential pollinator habitat. So this was legislatures hearing from their constituents that they wanted funding for pollinators, which is great. And this is especially aimed at the rusty patch bumblebee, which is our first endangered bee species in the country. But obviously this will also positively impact other at-risk pollinator species. So the funding that was passed through the legislature was handed down to the Board of Water and Soil Resources, also abbreviated as BWSR, to develop a grant program to utilize this funding. And so they developed a program that was split into two different forms, individual support, which anybody in the state of Minnesota can apply for. And this is actually the facilitating agency of this individual support program is Blue Thumb, which is a nonprofit organization based in the metro. And so anybody in the state of Minnesota can apply for that, and you receive a $350 reimbursement. And so the other type of grant for this program is the demonstration neighborhoods, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. And so that program is available for agencies like soil and water conservation districts, watershed districts, cities, agencies like that. And you had to select a specific neighborhood to utilize the funding. So how those areas were selected or how they were ranked was based off of this priority map. And the Board of Water and Soil Resources put it together based on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife's rusty patch bumblebee current range. And so the dark green areas, that's priority area 1, and that is where the rusty patch bumblebee has already been observed in the past few years, or that the habitat is conducive where it probably will exist. We just haven't seen it. The lighter green areas, that's priority area 2. And if restored, those would provide excellent habitat corridors to connect to already existing habitat. So you'll notice a lot of them are kind of following river corridors. And then the light yellow area, that's priority area 3, and the rusty patch bumblebee has not yet been observed in those areas. And there's a picture of the rusty patch bumblebee. It's got a little rusty patch on its back, which gives it its name. Okay, so you're going to hear me say the word pollinator a lot. There's a lot of buzz about pollinators lately because of their importance. And so I just thought it would be good to highlight a couple of those importance that the pollinators bring. So they provide a lot of services for people and a lot of other animals out in nature. And so there's kind of a saying that goes, 1 in every 3 bites of food is thanks to a pollinator. And if you think about it, you know, the fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds that you eat on a daily basis, a lot of those need to be pollinated. And so if we didn't have pollinators providing that service, the chances of having those resources would be slim, or they'd be very expensive because they'd have to find mechanical ways to pollinate. And also wildlife depend on pollinator-dependent foods. So 85% of fruits, nuts, and seeds you find in the wild are also thanks to pollinators. And on top of just them providing pollinator resources, they're also an important part of the food web. And so I have a little picture here of a cartoon of the food web just to help illustrate that. Our pollinator in this photo is the little butterfly or moth at the bottom, kind of by the grasses and flowers. So if you take that out of the food web, in this example, that's going to impact that little frog, which is going to impact the owl, the fox, the snake, and I think that's supposed to be a cougar way at the top or something like that. So if you take out one thing from the food web, it really has a big impact. So pollinators are very important. And when we think about native pollinators, they require some pretty specific habitat. So when I say native pollinator, I mean pollinators that have originated in Minnesota. I know a lot of people, when they think of pollinating, they think of honeybees. So there's actually around 450 native bee species in the state. So that's a lot of different bees, and they require very specific habitats. And when you want to provide floral resources for pollinators, like flowers, you also need to provide them with a place to stay, so a nesting habitat. So a majority of our bee species are actually solitary. So that means they don't live in a huge hive or community or colony like we think of the honeybee. They live alone. They might live in a group with other of the same species, but they're not sharing resources. They're providing for themselves. And so a large majority of our solitary native bees are ground nesting. So they require bare ground with loose soil, sometimes even gravel, where they can burrow their little chambers and create cavities for their larvae. And so they dig each individual cavity and lay one larva in each cavity for it to develop and grow. So that's about 70% of our native bee species, they're ground nesting. And then about 29% of those native bee species are stem nesting. So you'll see a lot of bee houses becoming more of a thing these days. You can find them at most any garden center. I'm sure you can even find them at Target. So their little constructed bee houses with some kind of hollow stick, usually bamboo, where the bees can create their nest. And so if you wanted to just create this in nature, you could leave a little pile of sticks or leave flower and grass stalks up in the fall for the bees to lay their nest. So the top picture there is actually a raspberry cane from my yard in Minneapolis, and almost all the cut ends of my raspberries have some kind of hole created from an insect. So some of them might not be a bee, but there could be bees in there. And then the picture below that is just an example, a close-up example of a bee house. So a constructed bee house with bamboo sticks. And then the bees will use different kinds of materials to create their little cavities and close up the end of the stem once they're done laying all their larvae. And then the last habitat are cavity nesting. And so I mentioned a lot of our native bees are solitary, though kind of one exception are the bumblebees. So there's several different bumblebee species, and they are social. They're not social to the extent of honeybees or wasps. They don't have thousands in their colony. They'll have a couple hundred maybe. And they require already created cavities, so they don't dig their own nest. So they like empty cavities in trees, in downed wood. They love abandoned rodent nests because they're already nice and padded with leaves and feathers and fur and stuff like that. So this is actually the picture of the cavity nesting. I took that in the Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge when I was doing some monitoring. And I wouldn't have known that was a bee nest if I didn't see a bumblebee come in and out of there. So it looks like that colony took over an abandoned gopher mound. So some different habitat considerations to keep in mind. So do we have any questions so far about the background of the program, why we care about pollinators, if anything is going on weird with the webinar so far? just plop it in the chat window, and we'll keep that in mind. Otherwise, I'll move on to give a little bit more information on turf grass, because a large portion of this program is dedicated to reducing the amount of turf grass that we have. And here is where I'm going to tell you why. I know a lot of people have very strong feelings about their lawns, which is very understandable because they are very useful for recreating and just hanging out on a nice summer day. But there's ways we can balance our turf grass lawns with having more natural areas. So a couple numbers, turf is actually the #1 irrigated crop in the country. And I call it a crop because it's kind of treated like one. You plant it, you water it, you fertilize it, and you harvest it on a weekly basis, whether you use the harvested material or not, that's up to you. So that's about 30 to 40 million acres in the country. And when we think of watering our lawns, because we're utilizing it as a crop, a lot of people that are connected to city water, so this might not impact a lot of you if you're on well water, that can account for 40 to 60% of a residential water utility. That's a pretty big chunk of a water utility, especially thinking of it as being water that has been treated so you can drink it. So you're putting nice, clean, drinkable water on your lawn. And also about 1.4 million pounds of pesticides are purchased annually for the sole use on lawns in Minnesota. And a lot of these pesticides are being found in groundwater and surface water. And with water utilities and pesticides, a lot of that is how do I put this? It's placed on a lawn inefficiently due to poor timing and poor calibration. So when I say poor timing, I mean, you know, you can drive around any residential area in the summer, maybe on like a 90-degree day and it's noon and you'll see somebody's irrigating their lawn. And you have to imagine a lot of that water is being evaporated. So not a lot of it is actually getting to the roots of that grass. And kind of the same thing with pesticides. Sometimes they're applied not at the correct time, so the grass isn't going to uptake the pesticide as readily as it would if it was applied at the proper moment. And a lot of that times it's hard to get the proper timing, especially if you're using a landscaper or something where, you know, they get you on their schedule when they can, and it might not be the perfect time. So an easy fix for that is really getting to know your soil, because your soil, if you have it tested, you can figure out exactly what kind of nutrients are already in there, and then you will know what to put down. And lastly, grass provides little to no habitat for pollinators, mainly because there's no flowering plants in the lawn if it's manicured that way. So that's just a little bit about turf grass. And now I'm going to move on to the demonstration neighborhood and kind of how we chose that area. So I have a map up here, and you'll see it's mostly in that dark green priority 1 area. So there's a teeny bit way at the southwest portion, that's the lighter green, that's priority area 2. So if you notice that's where you live, keep that in mind, because we'll come back to that at the very end of the presentation. So it's not the entire Big Eagle Lake watershed, but we're calling it the Big Eagle Lake community, because there's a little bit, you'll notice, kind of up to the northeastern side by the Uncas sand dunes that we included. And because it is close to a natural area, so we're able to connect those pathways to just expand upon the habitat for the pollinators. And actually, according to the DNR, the rusty patch bumblebee was successfully found in the Sand Dunes State Forest in 2017. So we know it's in the area. So we just need to try our best to provide more habitat for it so it can expand its habitat. And then lastly, the Uncas Dunes Scientific Natural Area is actually named after the Uncas skipper, which is a butterfly. And it's a very special butterfly. It's endangered, and it's really only found in that area of Sherburne County in the entire state. So if you look on the DNR's website and look up Uncas skipper, Sherburne County is the only county highlighted to have a known population of the Uncas skipper. And it requires a pretty specific habitat, pretty specific plants, and that are only found in sand dune type habitats. So if we can create more habitat for it, maybe we can help it expand its population reach. So a couple goals of the demonstration neighborhood program is to increase awareness for the need for pollinator habitat. So even if you don't work with us on some kind of practice, we just want to reach out to as many people as we can to get them to be aware of why we need pollinator habitat, why it's important. And we also slowly want to change the perceptions of what people consider a perfect yard. A lot of people think it's green lawn and that's about it. And you know, that's understandable because that's been ingrained in our brains for a very long time. And in a lot of cities, that's by law. That's what you have to have. There's a lot of landscaping ordinances that don't really make it conducive to do anything except have a green lawn. You can't have certain things above like 12 inches or the city will come and cut it down and they'll fine you for their time. So luckily, people are a little more aware of the importance of pollinator habitat, and a lot of city ordinances are putting in amendments for pollinator habitat as long as the landowner has some kind of management plan. And keep putting up signs. That's super important, is just signing everything so your neighbors know what you're doing and why you're doing it. And so obviously we want to increase pollinator habitat, so that's increasing host plants. So when I say host plant, you think of the relationship of the monarch butterfly with milkweed. The monarch lays its eggs on the milkweed plant, and then the caterpillar eats the milkweed leaves. A lot of butterflies have very specific host plants like that. For instance, the Uncas skipper, its host plant is actually a grass. It's called hairy grama and is a native dry prairie short grass. And so it lays its eggs on that grass, and then the caterpillars eat the grass until they emerge into a butterfly. And then obviously we want to increase the amount of forage plants, so plants that pollinators are using to get nectar from. And like I mentioned earlier, increase nesting habitat so the pollinators have a place to live. And finally, creating habitat corridors to connect the small pockets of habitat to other pockets of habitat, and eventually leading to an existing natural area like the sand dunes. So there's some secondary benefits to this program as well. One of those is erosion control, because we are using native plants that have really extensive root systems, so they do a great job of stabilizing the soil. I know this picture is really small, but if you'll notice in the, let's see if we're looking at it, the left side, there's teeny tiny grass. It's really hard to see, but that's your typical turf grass, which is Kentucky bluegrass. The roots go down maybe 3 to 5 inches, so they don't do a great job of providing soil stabilization. So that's why I like to point out why native plants are so great at that, because some of their root systems go down 15 feet. So they do a great job of stabilizing the soil, and they also create channels for infiltrating water, and they create habitat for soil microorganisms to help increase that soil organic matter. That's very important, and what Sherburne County is lacking, being in such a sandy area. Also, stormwater mitigation and water quality improvement, that kind of go hand in hand. Excess runoff will be captured by the plants, and any solids will settle out, and any excess nutrients will be taken up by the plants. And especially if they're planted on a lake shore, that provides a really good buffer between the water and your existing turf grass lawn. So it'll capture any runoff before entering the lake. All right, another break for questions. Don't see anything in the chat window yet, but if you had something burning that you wanted to ask, now's the time. And this is actually a photo of an Uncas skipper, if anyone was curious what they look like. It's not a super flashy butterfly, but still special. They've been compared to a jet plane, because apparently they're very fast. A little fun fact. All right, I don't see any questions, so I'm going to move on to the planting options that are in this program. So there's 4 main planting options you can choose from. And I'm just going to list them all now, and then we'll go into more detail in a few slides. So there's pocket planting, which are smaller plantings. There's pollinator meadows, which is more of a turf conversion to native plants. And adding beneficial trees and shrubs. And lastly, a bee lawn. So the pocket planting, these are great for beginners because they are smaller, and they usually incorporate mulch to kind of help control maintenance and make the garden look a little more formal. So this could be anything from a 10 by 10 plot with just adding a few live plugs and a mulch bed. This also includes rain gardens, which are typically 200 to 300 square feet for a residential sized rain garden. And a rain garden is basically a shallow garden that is meant to capture runoff from some kind of hard surface. So it could be directing rooftop gutter water or water from a driveway or a sidewalk. Some are even collecting runoff from streets. And so they're meant to capture that water and allow it to soak into the ground instead of running off into the nearest body of water. So those plants uptake any excess nutrients. And then we also have shorelines. So those are a great way to create a nice buffer between your water and your existing lawn that provides really great habitat and helps stabilize your shoreline as well. So the next project is the pollinator meadow. So this one is maybe for those that are a little more experienced with utilizing native plants, because this practice does take some patience. There's a saying that goes for native plants: the first year they sleep, the second year they creep, and the third year they leap. So the first couple of years, they're really working on their root system. So you remember that image I had a few slides back of how deep native plant roots go. It takes a while for that to happen. And a lot of native plants need a winter season, that freeze-thaw action, to help crack the seed and open it up to prepare the seed for germination. So it might take a season or two for the plants to even germinate. And typically for this project, we would suggest utilizing seed because it keeps the installation costs lower. And so you'll usually see establishment period happening within 3 to 4 years. Some individual species might take longer, some might take less. So usually you'll have some kind of flowering plant within the first 2 or 3 years. So patience is key for this one. And then we have beneficial trees and shrubs. So this is another one that's great for beginners because you can just incorporate flowering trees and shrubs into either your existing landscape, or you can incorporate into another planting type, like the pocket or the pollinator meadow. And there's a lot of different varieties of trees and shrubs that are both attractive for us. They have really pretty flowers, and they're a really great source for pollinators. And something we don't normally think about is in the early spring, that's when we have, it's the trees and shrubs that are kind of the only pollinating source for insects. So I know willows usually are blooming end of March, depending on what the spring is like. I know maples have already bloomed. A lot of service berries in woodlands have already bloomed. So for those early emerging pollinators, that's a really important food source for them. And some bees have already emerged. I don't know what it looks like where you guys are, but there's snow on the ground where I am, so I feel kind of bad for those bees. But there's still flowering trees available for them right now. So I have included a list here. It's not all encompassing, but it's just the top 10 trees and shrubs for the rusty patch bumblebee. Okay, moving on to the last project type. These are the bee lawns. So this is a type of practice for those that still want a functioning lawn, but they want to include habitat for pollinators. So this is just incorporating shorter growing flowering plants and drought-tolerant grasses with deeper roots into your existing lawn, or you could also start from scratch if you have a new property. And this is one of the only practices that allows non-native plants, but there's also native plant options as well. So the first picture is the standard bee lawn mix. It's a clover mix that the University of Minnesota developed. And unfortunately, I can't send you to the Arboretum to look at the demonstration plots because they're closed to the public, but whenever they open again, they have a few different demonstration plots of bee lawns that are great to take a look at. So that mix includes Dutch white clover, creeping thyme, self-heal, and then a couple different varieties of fescue grasses that have deeper roots than your typical lawn grass, and they're more drought tolerant, so you don't need to fertilize them. And then there's also a lot of different native species that you can incorporate into your lawn, especially being in Sherburne County. We have very sandy soil. A lot of our typical grasses don't like to grow there. They want more organic, rich soil. So there's a lot of different short flowers that work well too. So you can kind of incorporate this in maybe an area of your lawn you don't utilize very much, and you're okay with having some flowers there. So we have wild strawberry. That's a really great ground cover. It grows in both sun and shade, and it spreads by these little rhizomes you can kind of see on the surface of the ground. And they do produce teeny tiny strawberries, so great for other wildlife aside from just pollinators. And then we also have violets. There's tons of different varieties of violets that you can incorporate into your lawn, and they will rebloom if they've been mowed. They'll pop right back up. And then we have blue grama. It's related to hairy grama that I mentioned earlier, the Uncas skipper uses. It's another short, dry prairie grass that loves the sandy soil here. So those are the 4 different planting options. Any questions about those? Nothing? I feel like I've been talking forever. No questions yet. All right, I will keep going. We just have a few more slides, and then we can open up to questions at the end. That's a little, I think that's a mason bee in that picture popping out of its little nest. Okay, so for site preparation, there's a few options that you can utilize depending on how much time you have. For some of the smaller projects, sheet mulching is a great option. You just need a few months for this. It's actually the best to maybe put down your sheet mulching in the fall and let it sit over winter, and then come spring, you can plant right into it. And this is what I actually did on a small portion of my property. I put down cardboard and laid some mulch over it in the fall. And then when the spring rolled around, the cardboard was mostly decomposed and the grass underneath was very dead. And I have very minimal weeds popping through that. So it worked really well. Obviously, you wouldn't want to use this if you're doing the pollinator meadow and have, I don't know, 4,000 square feet. That'd be a lot of cardboard to keep track of. Another great thing for the smaller property or smaller projects is sod removal. There's manual and mechanical ways of removing sod, and then you basically can plant right into that if you remove a lot of the root system, so that you don't have to wait a very long time in order to get your planting started. Another a little more labor-intensive site prep is solarization. So that's just utilizing plastic sheets, and you cover it over your existing vegetation, and it has to sit for a few months, and the power of the sun will kind of bake the grass underneath and make your area ready for whatever planting you put down. And that you kind of have to be careful. You really need to anchor the plastic in well, otherwise a windy day could blow it away. And sourcing the plastic can sometimes be tricky. And then lastly, this is the least preferred method for the Board of Water and Soil Resources. Because we are planting for pollinators, we want to reduce the amount of herbicide as much as we can. But we also understand there's time constraints. I mean, this is a 3-year grant, so we don't have 5 years to have everybody work on organic site prep methods. So using herbicide on your area before planting is also an option. You just have to make sure you wait the proper amount of time before planting, because the herbicide can stay in the soil for a little bit. So you don't want to plant your native plants in them to be affected by herbicide. All right, so plant selection. And this is something that if you opt to do a project, we will definitely work with you on picking, well, helping both with helping you choose the proper site prep for your project and plant selection. So we'll work with you on a plant design. But if you want to do some research ahead of time, these are some things to consider. Most of these projects, except B-Lawn, do require the use of native plants. So you want to make sure they are locally sourced. And you also want to keep in mind the height, because if you're doing one of the smaller projects like the pocket planting, and if it's right next to a walkway or a driveway, you don't want to choose a plant that might grow 7 feet tall and have the chance of flapping over and getting in the way of your walkway. And you also want to keep in mind bloom period. As a part of this grant, we have to have plants, at least 3 plants blooming in each bloom period. So I just mean spring, summer, and fall. So there's some kind of resource for pollinators from when they emerge to when they go dormant in the fall. And also, if you have a smaller planting, you want to keep in mind the aggressiveness level of certain species. The second flower in my little graphic at the bottom is wild bergamot, and that is a beautiful prairie plant, and rusty patch bumblebee love it, but it is a little on the aggressive side, so it's great for the pollinator meadow application, but might not be the best if you're doing a smaller pocket planting. So that's just something to keep in mind. And also, depending on your site, you want to keep in mind if it's really sunny or shady, if you have super dry soil, or if maybe it's by a lake, so you have a little more moist soils. You just want to keep in mind the site requirements, because different plants obviously will do better depending on that. And again, here I have a list of the top 10 flowering plants. It's not all encompassing, it's just what has been found to be preferred by the rusty patch bumblebee. All right, and then the pictures on the bottom is just to kind of give you some examples of flowers starting in the spring and ending in the fall. So you can have color all season long. Okay. So maintenance considerations. I feel like when native planting projects first started, there was miscommunication, because a lot of people think, well, they're native, they shouldn't need any maintenance, they should just be able to take care of themselves. Well, that is kind of true. You still need to do some maintenance to really get them started so they will succeed. So that first couple year period, it's really crucial to work on maintenance to make sure the planting doesn't get outcompeted by non-native weeds. And so just like any new planting, if you're using live plugs or trees and shrubs, you will need to water them. Usually just during the first growing season, about 1 inch per week. The second growing season, they should be able to take care of themselves unless we have a couple weeks of drought. If you're using the mulch bed method, regular weeding will be crucial during the first 2 to 3 years. And it's always suggested to plant your native plants in clumps, so you can really tell when a weed is out of place. If it's not in that clump, it's probably not what you planted. Makes weeding a lot easier. If you have the pollinator meadow, a really good form of maintenance is mowing or burning every 4 to 6 years, because our native plants evolved with disturbances like wildfires and flash grazing from bison. So just kind of incorporating that into the management really helps rejuvenate that planting. Refreshing mulch as needed, replacing any plants that have died, usually within the first year or two, just to avoid any large gaps for weeds to take over. Cleaning out, if you opt for the rain garden, cleaning out the inlet regularly, mainly after rain events, just to make sure there's no debris like leaves or sticks or anything that could clog up the inlet. And all of this maintenance, you can contract a native landscape professional. They're very proficient in maintaining these types of projects. And I did notice there's a question, what type of mulch would you recommend? That's an excellent question. We prefer shredded hardwood mulch versus like a pine or cedar bark mulch because it lasts a lot longer, and it kind of, the shredded, how it's shredded, it really interlocks with the other pieces so it doesn't float away during a rain event. So great question. So any other questions on maintenance or plant selection, anything like that? Like I said, we'll work with you more one-on-one, and I'm kind of going to go into that detail here with our funding assistant process. So basically, we can all check off the first box. We want everyone to participate in a webinar, or this is also being recorded, so somebody can look at or watch this on a later date. And then the next step would be a site visit, or depending on the circumstance, a phone call might have to do to discuss your goals, what you want in your project. And so you would work with an SWCD staff on a design, and with that design you can bring that to local vendors to receive a cost estimate, and then with that cost estimate will help you draw up a cost share contract, and that contract just basically states that you're putting in this project, you need to keep it there for a certain amount of time to provide the pollinator benefits that we're looking for. And that needs to be approved by our board of supervisors that meets once a month. But once that is approved, then your project can begin. Basically, you don't want to make any purchases or start any work until it's been approved by the board. And we will let you know when you can start, because anything that's purchased before your contract is not eligible for reimbursement. So keep that in mind. And so you can begin your project once you have an approved contract, and we typically like to meet with you before the project is actually installed, just to make sure everybody's on the same page and to answer any last minute questions. And so once you're done, you submit your receipts and invoices, and then we'll work with you on checking off the project. So we'll come and do another site visit to make sure it was installed correctly. And then we have to submit your project for reimbursement to our board of supervisors. So this is a reimbursement process. So you have to pay for all of the materials up front, and then you will get a reimbursement once the project is complete. So speaking of reimbursement, all of the projects have different reimbursement caps. So in this little table here, you'll see the small native garden has a reimbursement of $500. Rain garden and shoreline are $2,000. Trees and shrubs $250. Pollinator meadow $2,000, and the bee lawn $500. And so this is a little different than our usual cost share program because it is such a specialized program for pollinators. So those of you that are in priority area 1, so that dark green area, you are actually eligible for 90% cost share. So that means you only need to contribute 10%, whether that's cash or labor if you're planning to install it yourself. And then I pointed out the lighter green area, that's priority area 2, you're eligible for 75%. So you have to contribute 25%, whether that's cash or labor. And off to the side here, the eligible expenses, it's most the materials involved with the project. Oh, and here I have the shredded hardwood mulch, but that's already been answered, so that's great. And you can contract a landscape company to do the installation if you don't feel comfortable doing it yourself.
Hey, Franny.
Yeah.
Do you want to go back one slide? There is a question pertaining to reimbursements.
Sure. All right, so let's just So yes, looks like there's two questions about our tree sale. So the Sherburne SWCD, we have an annual tree seedling sale every year that you can start ordering in January, and then pickup is at the end of April or beginning of May usually. So we're currently in that right now. Our pickup for this year is May 1st and 2nd. So most everybody that's already ordered trees will have to pick them up then. So like I mentioned, you can't make any purchases before you have a contract. So if you wanted to order trees and shrubs with us through our tree sale, you would have to wait to do your project until next year. And it is a little late to do that this year anyway, because a lot of our trees and shrubs are already sold out. I hope that answers that question. But those trees and shrubs that we sell are available for reimbursement as long as you already have a contract with us. So this is the last slide I have. It just has some additional resources if you wanted to do some research on more of the background of the Lawns to Legumes program. The Bowser's Lawns to Legumes webpage is a great place to start. And it has a whole slew of resources for those that maybe are just interested in getting more information and want to go forward with a project on their own. I gathered a lot of information for this presentation from the next resource, the Planting for Pollinators Guide. It's a very long packet, but it has a lot of great information on all of the different planting types, information on site prep, and where you can find native plants and things like that. The next resource is a website that's called Minnesota Wildflowers. If you've never been, I would highly suggest it if you're interested in learning more about native plants and what's out there. I utilize this website all the time. You can look up plants based on their color. So if you don't know the name, you can just go to all the yellow flowers and take a look at what's there. And it also has non-native invasive species on there. So if you find something in your yard and you're interested in what it is, and oh, there, look, it's an invasive species, I should get rid of this. So it has lots of pictures at different stages and different parts of the plant. So it's a great place to learn about native plants. And then the last resource is the native plant suppliers list that is on the DNR's website. It's pretty all-encompassing for all of the different vendors that you can find that have native plants, and a lot of them are really great at having that locally sourced type of plant that we require. And I will email these resources out to everybody when I send the recording link, so you will have those there. And with that, I noticed a few more questions in the chat window, so I'm going to try to answer those. Okay, so a question about, I'm going to go back to the reimbursement. We have some questions about that. So these reimbursement caps are per project. So like the tree and shrub, if you're doing a tree and shrub planting, you get $250 per the entire planting. So you might have 5 different shrubs. So you would get $250 for those 5 shrubs, as long as it is within that either 90% or 75% cost share. And then who would we contact for site planning? That would be us. You would work directly with the Sherburne Soil and Water Conservation District. So here is my contact info. And if you registered, you should already have my email and phone number. So the first step would be to have a site visit with one of the SWCD staff members, and we work with you throughout the whole process. And we don't charge for our site visits. So hopefully that answers that question. Any more questions? Otherwise, that's all I have. Hopefully everybody learned something. I'll just give everybody a minute. Oh, I wanted to do one quiz question. I'm going to do that right now. So I talked a lot about bees. Why do you think bees are the best at pollinating? Let's see if anybody can come up with an answer. Why are bees the best pollinators? I'll give you guys 30 seconds. So, all right. I see furry and busy. They are very busy and they are furry. They're the only pollinators that actively collect pollen. They're the only ones that actually are collecting pollen to eat. So they make what's called bee bread. So they use pollen and that's what they feed their larvae. So all the other pollinators, butterflies, other insects, they're only going after the flower for the nectar. So bees actively collect pollen and that's why they are so fuzzy, because they need to collect pollen. So fun fact of the day, you can bring that to your next virtual dinner party. All right, with that, thank you so much for joining us over this lunch hour, and I will send you all information later today, and you can contact us if you are interested in participating in this program. So thank you.